Hey guys, welcome back. So we'll get started with our weekly review, and then I have kind of a breakdown of some key dates that are going to lead us to the end of the year. A couple of them may change, but for the most part, I think they'll stay where they are. So for this week, Monday and Tuesday, you have one note, but it's a pretty lengthy note, and I want you to divide it into two sections. So on the Monday, I really just want you to focus on the structure of the brain, some of the key functions, and then the branches of the nervous system. So we'll review those. I'll do a review of that note actually at the end of the video. So just pay attention. I'll go through the stuff I want you to know for the Monday. Then Tuesday, you'll be on your own finishing the note reading for the tools. I'm also going to review last week's note on the respiratory tract real quickly, just to kind of summarize some key points for you guys. So that's just what's on today's video, but let's get through the weekly video or breakdown here. Wednesday, you have a review period, so use the review questions of the Kahoot I sent out and just study your notes. It's not going to be a fairly long quiz, but it's just to say we had a quiz on those cardio tools. It's only on anything related to the cardio system. There'll be no respiratory or nervous questions related. So if it's not in the review package, don't worry about it. So that brings us to the end of the week. Friday, you have your discussion as is, pretty straightforward there. And looking ahead to the end of the week, so let's kind of work our way back. So that we have 4 more weeks, including this week. The last week is obviously your exam week, the review week, and then after this week, and then before pretty much the exams start, you'll have your final paper, project. It's going to be a paper, or maybe if I can think of a way to make them kind of fun at home labs or something. I'm either gearing towards one of those two. So if you guys have a really big preference, no, we don't want to do another paper, we want to do an at-home lab, or oppositely, an at-home lab. Midst right now is probably pretty difficult to just make sure you have everything. So the paper just might be the safer route. If you have any feedback on that, shoot me a message, guys. But right now I'm probably leaning towards paper just out of simplicity. But I mean, the lab would be fun. Unit 3 test. So this is going to be a practice test. So point blank, it's going to just be questions on any tools we talked about and any anatomy we talked about through the unit. And it's going to be, you get 100% if you just finish it. It's not going to be worth a lot. It's just a practice test, okay? So if you don't get it, you get a 0. If you don't do it and finish every question, you get a 0. I don't care if you write, I don't understand this topic or something. If you write, leave it blank, it's a 0. So you got to go through every question and at least try and answer them your best. Again, just practice, so you don't have to study for it, but it just shows you how much or how well prepared you are for the topics. May 11th to 15th, the week leading up to the exams, that's going to be our review week. So I'll do a nutrition review on the Monday, Tuesday. Wednesday, Thursday, I'll review our diseases and pathogens unit. And then on the Friday, I'll kind of quickly revise all the stuff. I'll take up that Unit 3 test, just make sure everybody's got everything kind of fresh in their mind from Unit 3. And then exam week. So same kind of dialing back to this paper. I haven't really picked an outline date. We'll see where our exam day falls, how we get through things. But I'll probably just push it as far back as possible because I know you guys all have, you'll probably have a bunch of papers and online exams to do. So just to give you more time, right? So that's kind of where I'm looking towards finishing the semester. Nothing too complicated. I'm thinking all of these days are set in stone, and it carries us pretty well to the end of the year. So that's kind of your weekly and monthly breakdown for the rest of the year. What we're going to do, guys, is we're going to look back at last week's respiratory note. We're just going to kind of quickly review some key points, what you need to know for the upcoming tests, and just maybe reiterate some information. So we'll skip through your learning goals. So non-invasive is a term that you're going to see used on your unit test, on your exam. You need to know that it means that you don't have to put the apparatus within inside the body. It means you don't need to essentially to perform any procedures. Cellular respiration, so as we breathe in oxygen, our body breaks down that, sorry, lost my train of thought there. So as we breathe in the oxygen, our body pairs it with glucose. In that process, we produce CO2, water, and energy. So then we have to exhale the CO2, sweat out the water, and then obviously we utilize the energy to perform whatever activity. Continues on to the muscles. Pulmonary, we use this term a bit when we were talking about the heart, the pulmonary arteries and the pulmonary veins. Knowing that pulmonary leads or involves actions around the lungs, we can see that the pulmonary veins and pulmonary arteries are key in bringing back oxygenated and deoxygenated to and from the lungs. Alveoli and diffusion. So the alveoli are where diffusion occurs. So that's the exchange of CO2 across a membrane, O2 in and CO2 out. Ventilation versus respiration. So there's a slight difference in that. So ventilation is just the physical movement of air to the lungs, and then respiration is the ability to convert the CO2 and the O2. So anatomy of the respiratory tract, I know it says be able to identify all. The things I'm most concerned with are the pharynx, larynx, trachea, bronchial, the alveoli, and the diaphragm. If you can identify those, you're going to be good for any questions. There won't be too much on that. But if you didn't know the anatomy of the respiratory tract, it is something you needed to know to understand the tools. So physical assessment, so this is kind of like the eye test and the ear test in a sense. So you have a patient come in, you're going to monitor how many breaths are they taking, how hard are they breathing. So if someone's just casually breathing, and maybe they have a few more breaths, that's not a big deal. But if they're having a lot of breaths and they're heavily breathing, that could indicate that they're struggling to get oxygen in. And function, so function's kind of an assessment of those two, so the rate and the effort that they're putting in, how well do those two things coincide. So PFTs, pulmonary function tests, so how well are the lungs working at getting oxygen out getting oxygen in and getting CO2 out. So there's a variety of PFT tests that we looked at. So the most common is the spirometry test. So in a general sense, it's just measuring and analyzing everything in your air, how much capacity you have, how much air you can physically hold at any given point through an inhale and the exhale. So when we look at these next terms, I'm not expecting you to actually know any of these, but it just expands on what kind of information you're getting back from the spirometer, and it's providing you with a lot of detail on how you're physically breathing. So that's crucial in determining where's the problem in this cycle. So just know that kind of general point at the end. Combining all of those variables together gives us the detailed information on their patterns. Breathing patterns, that is. Pulse oximetry, so I'll just quickly show you again. That's a pulse oximeter. Measures the oxygen content in the blood. You want to be 95 or higher ideally. If you're below 92%, that's hypoxemia, meaning you have a low blood oxygen count. Fino Test. So Fino tests are used to detect the presence of nitrous oxide in the person's breath. And the reason you want to know why a person has, or why you would measure nitrous oxide in the breath, is that it's an indication of how, or if someone has asthma. Someone who has asthma is going to have more nitrous oxide in their breath. You could almost think of this comparatively. I believe we touched on it with lactose intolerance. So when they do a lactose test, what they'll do is they'll get a baseline measure of what the person is, then they'll give them some lactose, and then they'll measure the hydrogen. If the hydrogen goes up, it means they're lactose intolerant because their body can't produce something. Just like someone who has asthma, their body can't have a certain reaction that results in a buildup of nitrogen. Arterial blood gas test. So again, this is just measuring how much CO2 is in the bloods. So with these tests, you're kind of getting different variables, and each variable is an indication more so of a different problem or disease. Vo2 Max, you guys have probably heard of this one. I know my kinesiologist from kinesiology class will know what this is. They probably hated it. But you can do it in a variety of ways, but what you're essentially measuring is how much air is being taken in and out of the lungs at maximal effort. So not just when you're sitting around resting. when you're exerting maximal effort during sport, how much energy or how much air can you breathe in? So there's a couple different ways you can do it. You can do step tests, treadmill tests, where you use calculations and variables based on your gender, sex, level, activity, or you can actually just get hooked up to the mask where it'll physically track how much air is going in and out. Similar to a spirometry test, but with exercise. So now that we've got that, we'll talk about some of the tools. Mainly with these guys, they're about either opening up the lungs or physically doing the act of breathing itself. So inhalers, you have two main types. So the reliever versus the preventer. So the name's kind of inherent, but the key terms you need to assess are bronchodilator to reliever and anti-inflammatory to preventer. So we'll start with the reliever. So if someone's having an asthma attack, it means that their alveoli are closing up. They can't transfer oxygen and CO2 efficiently. Predominantly, they can't get O2 in. So that's where they would take the bronchodilator. So if we take the term bronchodilator, we're going to see bronchioles at the beginning, so referring to the area it's targeting, and dilator refers to what is it doing. A dilator is when something dilates, it opens up. So if you think of your eyes dilating, your eyes dilate, they get bigger. Same with your lungs. If you take a bronchodilator, they open up. Some of these are used not just like with these mix of drugs or that specific one, but there are other bronchodilators that athletes use beforehand. The problem with any PED, ergogenic aid, if you use them too much, you become dependent on it. So don't want to do that. And then the preventer, so the key thing is anti-inflammatory, so you're preventing the onset of inflammation. So this is going to depend on what type of asthma they have, which one they'll use. But again, you just want to attach those two key terms. Again, bronchodilator is the reliever, anti-inflammatory is the preventer. Sorry, I think we skipped one there. Nebulizers. So pretty general. These just convert whatever substance or drug they need to take into a mist form. By converting it to a mist form, it can be taken deeper into the lungs where it'll have a better effect. So that's typically the nebulizers more used for things that, like an inhaler obviously in a sense is a nebulizer as it gives it out as a gas, but things that would be more commonly taken in pill form. Resuscitators, so this physically opens the lungs. This is something you would use if you're performing CPR on someone. Their nervous system shut down, they're dying, they're unconscious, they're not breathing, so what you're going to do is physically pump some air into them, then try and get their heart beating again to kind of get that rhythm back. It's a lot more elaborate than that, but just kind of in a general sense, what are you doing with the filling of the air with that ventilator, with the resuscitator, and then what are you doing with the heartbeats? A ventilator, so it assists in breathing, so if someone cannot perform the act of breathing themselves, it's an automated breather. And then respirator prevents you from breathing in any hazardous chemical that you should not breathe in. So that's just a quick run through again of those respiratory things. Now we'll just quickly review some nervous system stuff. I shouldn't have said review because you guys are just technically scheduled to get this note today, but if you read ahead of time, it came out early. So just fix that up. So what we're going to be starting to talk about here, guys. Sorry, I actually did this one again, but it didn't work out. Hard drive's too full of memory or something. So what we'll do is we'll first start by talking about what is the nervous system, a general nervous response, and then we'll start talking about some different areas of the nervous system. So, in general, what is the nervous system? It's the composition of your nerves and how they relay messages from the brain to our muscles, and as well as how they respond to stimuli to send to the brain initially. So most nervous responses or nervous actions are a result of three things: a stimuli, integration, and then it's followed up by the motor output, so the actual action itself. Try to make sure you guys can read those real nicely. So the stimuli is pretty much what you think it is. It's any thing that activates the five senses and the body is going to take notice to. Integration is the processing of that stimuli and determining what the corresponding or appropriate motor output is. And then the motor output is when that reaction is sent from the brain to the muscles and they carry out whatever the determined action was during integration. So we'll talk about something in a second when we talk about involuntary versus voluntary. So the central nervous system, first off, is just a physical division of the brain and spine. That's what it's composed of. They relay a lot of messages and are, again, that's why it's called the central nervous system, the core part of it as they do all that integration. Some processes that are involuntary do not use the central nervous system though. So we'll talk about the difference here. Or sorry, not the difference. A variable is called the reflex arc. So with the reflex arc, there's no integration from the response. So meaning with a typical response, let's say it's just something on your hand, the stimuli is sent to the brain, up the spinal cord to the brain, back down with the motor output. So there was integration there, right? The stimuli got up to the brain determined an output. When there's something like, let's say you put your hand on something really hot, it could potentially harm you in that time where it takes for that response to get to the brain to respond. So it's kind of like a built-in reflex and safety mechanism that the message wouldn't be sent up for integration. It'll actually only reach the spinal cord, and then it'll send back out a message to say, take your hand off. And then afterwards, you'll have some integration after the motor output. Was that enough? Do I need to take it farther away? So on and so forth. So reflex arc means there's no integration. It's just stimuli, motor output. The best example that you can think of for this would be the knee-jerk test. So it's what the doctors use just as a general assessment of a nervous function or nervous system function. So if they're sitting there and then you hit them with the hammer and it takes them a long time for them to kick out their knee, it indicates that there's a poor relay of that message to the spinal cord and back. So again, with that example, the stimuli, the knees hit, message is sent up to the spine, message is sent back. There's no message to the brain. Maybe afterwards, there's some thought on it, but there's no actual processing of this is our motor output. So that's the central nervous system. Again, it's just physically dividing the spine and brain into their own section, and then the peripheral nervous system. So this is all the nerves outside that connect both the central and peripheral nervous system. So before we continue with the autonomic and somatic systems, which are divisions of the peripheral nervous system, I want to tell you what the terms voluntary and involuntary would mean. So voluntary action is something that has integration and you've thought of the output, whereas an involuntary action is something that you're not thinking of and not consciously worrying about. So the best example of a conscious action or a voluntary action is, raising your hand, doing a squat, other stuff like that. And then somatic is, autonomic or involuntary actions are things that we don't think about. So our breathing, our heart rate, our body just keeps them going automatically, and there's no integration or thought process behind those actions. So I kind of gave it away there. The autonomic system, you can refer to as the automatic system. So it's going to handle all of those involuntary actions. So the things you don't think about, again, blinking, breathing, digestion, stuff like that. Somatic is going to take care of all voluntary responses. So they really deal more so with your musculoskeletal system and those type of responses that we're more consciously making. So again, the easiest way, autonomic, automatic, best way to remember it. Now, going into the sympathetic versus the parasympathetic, these are divisions of the autonomic. So again, these are processes that we have no conscious control over. They're just happening as our body is, given the stimuli that it needs. There's no thought process. Sympathetic versus parasympathetic. So I think storage, preservation, because all of the, that's backwards. This guy's usage, that's one's preservation. So sympathetic is about how do we utilize all of the body's energy in order to increase, or by increasing blood pressure, increasing heart rate, stuff like that. The parasympathetic is more concerned with how do we preserve energy. So is that our sleep, our digestion, our metabolism, stuff like that. So how much energy are we retaining? Going back to the sympathetic, it's also commonly thought of as your fight or flight, and this one could be thought of as your sleep one, sleep and restoration. So that's just kind of a quick walkthrough of the branches of the nervous system. So next week I'll come back with a video. We'll look at the brain anatomy. I really want you guys to again be able to identify the 4 lobes. So that's the frontal, the temporal on the side, the parietal, and then the occipital is just at the back above the cerebellum. Be able to identify the brainstem, so that would be just kind of coming up the back here. It's a little hard to see, so back of the brain right there. Again, you're not really actually seeing it. I think that the thalamus, I want you to know the role of it, because as that message comes up the spine through the stem, it goes through the thalamus, which is going to filter which area of the brain is going to determine or handle that response. Then you'll get into a little left versus right hemisphere. That's pretty straightforward. That I really want you to focus on what is the corpus callosum doing. So just to quickly summarize it, your brain is divided into left and right, but you actually get information from the opposite ways. I know that sounds a little convoluted, but your left eye is going to feed to the right side, and your right eye is going to feed to the left side. You have this thing in the middle that mediates between the two and sends impulses between the left and right. That's the corpus callosum. Now, back in the day, before there was medications to treat seizures, they believed that if you separated or removed the corpus callosum, that the seizure, the electrical impulses, wouldn't be able to bounce back and forth between left and right side. They would just be contained to either one side. So it did actually help with seizures, but as you'll see, we do rely on some cognitive function from that corpus callosum. So when our two sides can't communicate, it leads to problems. So again, you have an artistic side, a mathematics side, and then it's split up within those areas into the different lobes and so forth. So that's it for this week, guys. I'll see you back next week. If you have any message or any problems or concerns about anything coming up, send me a message as usual, but talk to you next week.